Well, Iran right now appears strong and confident on the global stage, bargaining hard, dictating terms in confrontation and negotiations with giants like the United States and Israel. But inside the country, the picture is very different. As summer heat intensifies, millions of Iranians are still living with recurring blackouts, weak or interrupted water supply, and factories shut down, and most importantly, rising health risks, all linked to years of mismanagement and fragile infrastructure. What looks like strategic strength abroad is increasingly built on a shaky domestic foundation, where everyday life is shaped by power cuts, empty taps, and discontent over basic services rather than just by the state's regional and diplomatic victories. So, in today's edition of From the News Desk, we will talk about how Iran's escalating power cuts and water shortages show a state that has invested heavily in external confrontation with the United States and Israel, but once again failed to secure basic services for its own people. Analysts say Iran's summer blackouts are not a sudden shock, but the result of years of low spending on power infrastructure, shaky leadership in the energy sector, and delays in modernizing aging plants and transmission lines. The country's electricity grids has long depended on cheap, heavily subsidized power that encourages high consumption but leaves producers without the revenue needed to reinvest in more effective regeneration or smarter networks, creating a structural imbalance that becomes acute whenever temperatures rise. Now, at the same time, chronic drought, over extraction of underground water, and shrinking reservoirs have pushed Iran towards what experts now describe as water bankruptcy, with dozens of major dams at critical levels and many wells, even those drilled to the depth of 150 meters, running dry. Now, most interestingly, energy and water officials themselves are sounding the alarm. The head of Parliament's environment faction recently warned that water inflows to dam reservoirs has dropped by more than a third compared to the last year, while total share of volume is well below the 5-year average, directly hitting hydroelectric output and leaving less room for emergency supply. In fact, Iran's energy minister has acknowledged that annual renewable water resources have fallen sharply over the past decade. And he also said that rising urban population combined with hotter summers are pushing existing systems beyond safe operating limits. Well, in Iran, rainfall has dropped to one of the lowest levels in recent years, yet daily water consumption has obviously surged to over 3 million cubic meters, driven in parts by evaporative coolers that can use up to 30 liters of water per hour, further straining already depleted reserves. Now, these stress factors are magnified by climate change, but researchers emphasize that governance failure play an equal, if not greater, role in this very crisis. Well, this includes poorly regulated agriculture expansion, outdated irrigation systems, leaky urban distribution networks, and, most worryingly, the continued use of treated drinking water for irrigation in parks and green spaces have all deepened the imbalance between supply and demand. Now, looking at all this, it won't be wrong to say that the country's power and water troubles stems not only from sanctions but from domestic decisions that left key infrastructure fragile, foreign investment limited, and technical expertise underutilized. For years, Tehran has blamed United States sanctions for much of its economic pain, and restrictions on finance and technology have undeniably made it harder to upgrade plants, import advanced equipment, or attract foreign partners into the energy sector. Yet experts increasingly argue that sanctions alone cannot explain why a resource-rich country with vast oil and gas reserves repeatedly struggles to provide reliable electricity and save water to its own population. Economists and energy specialists point instead to a political short-termism, deep subsidies, and uneven resource allocation, which together have trapped Iran in a cycle where cheap power, delayed reform, and corruption weaken the very system people depend on. And obviously, years of prioritizing military, nuclear, and intelligence projects over civilian infrastructure have left fewer funds for repairing dams, modernizing the grids, or desalination and recycling capacity, even as demand continues to rise. But the more worrying part is that large public contracts are often awarded to companies tied to powerful institutions such as the Revolutionary Guard Corps, with critics saying this bets insufficiencies, delays, and cost overruns that can stretch a project meant to take 2 years into a decade or more. Now, tariff reforms that could gradually move Iran away from unsustained cheap electricity have been repeatedly postponed just for fear of public backlash, while genuine attempts at water governance reform have been piecemeal and too limited to reserve long-term trends. Now, the result is a system where daily life dependency on emergency measures such as public holidays to reduce demand during peaks, rolling blackouts announced at very short notice, and threats of 12-hour water cuts for households that exceed consumption guidelines. Remember, in several cities, protests had erupted back in December 2025, with demonstrators chanting that water and electricity are basic rights after repeated outages left homes without cooling and businesses unable to operate. Now, these seeds fed into a broader sense among many Iranians that the state can mobilize quickly for regional confrontation but struggles to maintain the most basic elements of normal life at home. Obviously, this domestic crisis is unfolding against a backdrop of intense regional tensions. War with US and Israel caused severe damage to oil facilities and other critical infrastructure. And undoubtedly, Iran fought back with absolute ferocity. Yet, while the leadership highlights its resistance abroad, ordinary Iranians now find themselves paying the price at home, facing blackouts, empty taps, and rising bills, even as inflation and unemployment erode their ability to cope. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the December 2025 protests over economic hardship and political repression had given external powers like the United States fresh opening to pressure Tehran and critiques its domestic record. Officials in Washington openly warned the Iranian government against violent crackdowns, while also pointing to currency collapse and energy shortages as signs of deeper systematic failure inside the country. Now, for many Iranians, however, the concern is less about geopolitical narratives than about immediate survival. Keeping food cold in a fridge that loses power at least twice a day, finding drinking water when taps run dry, or protecting elderly relatives in apartments that turn into ovens when air conditioning falls during the hottest hours. Now, as this summer's crisis deepens, the biggest question now is whether Tehran can or will rebalance its priorities away from constant external confrontation and towards repairing the social contract with its own people. That would basically mean investing seriously in water and power infrastructure, accepting the political cost of reforming cheap energy policies, tackling corruption in public contracts, and most importantly, treating access to basic services as strategic obligation, not as afterthought. Now, without such a shift, Iran may continue to claim victories in its struggles with Washington and Tel Aviv, yet still loses the quieter, more consequential battle at home, the fight to keep the lights on and the taps running for the citizens whose life it is meant to protect. Well, with that, it's a wrap on today's edition of From the News Desk. Thank you so much for watching, and I'm Yash Goyal signing off for Times Now Digital. Until next time, take care and keep watching this space for more such videos.